Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Nail-biter seems to be the universal headline. Instead of a blue wave sweeping Joe Biden into the White House, the former vice president is eking out a series of small but crucial victories across several swing states. Donald Trump could yet try and thwart the Democrats with legal challenges. Dismiss him at your peril, me included, I have to say. Once again, the opinion polls have been confounded, and not just by a few percentage points. 538's poll of polls had predicted Biden would win by 4.8 points in Wisconsin, 7.9 in Michigan, 4.7 in Pennsylvania, 2.5 in Florida, and so on. How could they be so wrong? Tonight, we're joined by Professor John Green, Director Emeritus of the Bliss Institute at Akron University, Ohio. Professor Green is one of the most foremost political analysts in the United States. Hello and welcome, John. Thanks so much for joining us.
You're very welcome, and thank you for having me. This is indeed a nail-biter of an election. I've been telling my students up until yesterday that this was an election like no other, and it turned out I was right. We haven't seen anything like this for a very long time, and certainly not in modern history. So what we've seen is before Election Day, the American presidential election was widely perceived as being very competitive, with 12 or so states, which could have been won conceivably by one candidate or the other, but with varying degrees of probability of victory for Biden or for Trump. But just 24 hours later, we're looking at a very different perception. What we have is a very close election where it will be decided by literally a handful of votes in a number of key states. It's not entirely clear which those states will be right now, but frankly, while this was a possibility that analysts had on their radar screen, no one was paying much attention to this possibility. Because usually, in a very competitive election, while individual states may go their own way, there's some kind of national trend that pushes enough of those states in one direction that one candidate wins. And that's where we got all of the discussion of a blue wave or a red wave, because that's what often happens in very competitive elections. Now, Nick made reference to the fact that there's a lot of challenges facing public opinion polling in the United States today, perhaps facing opinion polling all over the world. And this seems to be a particularly good example of how those challenges were not met by a vast array of polling organizations, some of them commercial, some of them nonprofit, some of them academic. Now, an easy answer would be that the methodologies were simply wrong. Except they were wrong on such, or inaccurate on such a large scale that perhaps it's not a measurement issue entirely, but what it is something unanticipated happened in the election. And I'm going to argue that, just because it's interesting, that what happened was something that was unanticipated. Perhaps it should have been anticipated, but it wasn't. And it's not the kind of thing that you can capture very well in opinion polls. Opinion polls are pretty good at measuring people's attitudes at a particular moment in time, but they're really not very good at measuring their behavior. And I think what we saw on Tuesday, and if we add into that the early voting which preceded Tuesday, what we saw was a very extensive but highly targeted effort at mobilizing voters. And from the perspective of the polls, the most successful campaign was the Republican campaign, which turned many, many states where there was an outside chance, people thought, that Donald Trump could prevail, to really close elections and in many cases, apparent victories for Donald Trump. And what we saw here, I think, was part of the broader Trump strategy. If you think back, it seems like a million years ago, back to January of 2020, before the pandemic became a big issue, the Trump campaign was thought itself well positioned to win the general election. And one of their strategies was to invest a lot of money, in fact, about $300 million in voter mobilization efforts. What in the United States we call the ground game, the effort to actually get voters either to go to the polls on election day or to turn in an absentee ballot or to vote early. A ground game encompasses all of those things. And then the pandemic hit, politics got very strange, and a lot of people largely forgot that strategic choice by the Republicans. The Republicans didn't forget it, though, and they continued to pursue it. Now, as the Biden campaign gathered momentum after the primaries and through the summer and began to raise a lot more money, they spent a lot of that money on advertising. The Trump campaign was actually outspent in advertising during the last few weeks of the campaign. But although some of the allies of the Republicans came in with some of their own money, they really, the Trump campaign stuck to their voter mobilization activities. And it seems to have paid off, at least as we compare it to the expectations. Whether it puts Donald Trump in the White House or not, of course, remains to be seen. So what I'd like to do is to show you, with looking at a couple of maps, how this mobilization worked out. And the first map I want to look at is the state of Ohio.
John, while Isabella's doing that, I'm just going to interject and give people an idea of what's coming up as well. So John will be speaking now for the next of 15 minutes or so. Then we've got Q&A with John. And then we've got a series of experts that we're going to be checking in with across the states. We'll be going back to Thomas Baldino, the professor in Pennsylvania. We've got Bill Hershey. Those of you who've traveled with us on our political tours in the States will remember Bill as our reporter and expert in Ohio. We've got Bradley Knott, who you can see there, who's a Democratic Party strategist in Iowa, and was also helping us out during the Iowa caucuses. So after we've finished with John, we've got a series of people who can give us an update on their own states and their own areas. Go ahead, John.
Well, thank you very much. And if anyone has any questions while I go through this, please feel free to ask them. But we'll be fairly brief. We won't be too detailed, but it will show, I think, some interesting patterns. So this is the New York Times map of the United States. And let's look inside Ohio at the different parts of the state and look at the voter mobilization. Now, Ohio, as many of you know, is a state of cities. It has a lot of large cities. It's not dominated by one or two, as most American states are. And you can see kind of in the middle of the state, a little bit to the south, Columbus, Ohio, which is in Franklin County. That is the capital of Ohio. That's a major urban area. And as you can see, it's fairly blue. That's an important county for Democrats. If we go diagonally up to the top of the page, you'll see Cleveland and the Akron area, which is in Summit County, just slightly south of Cuyahoga County. That's another important area for the Democrats. And then if you go diagonally down to the bottom of Ohio, you'll come to Cincinnati. These are called the three C's in Ohio politics, three very important areas for the Democrats. Now, if you were comparing this to other maps, parts of the New York Times maps, you'll notice that the blues are not very blue. And part of the reason is although the Democrats did a very good job of mobilizing some of their voters, they were not as effective with their inner city votes as they have been in the past. In fact, these counties are underperforming compared to what they did in 2016. Itself, of course, a very competitive election in Ohio. But what's interesting is to step back and focus on the map as a whole. These little islands of blue, where many, many voters live, are surrounded by the pink suburbs and the red hinterland. And this is where Donald Trump really won the election in Ohio, as he did in 2016 as well. He was able to bring out more voters and more Republican voters in these suburban and rural areas. Interestingly enough, one of the most historically Democratic counties in Ohio, Mahoning County, which is up sort of towards the top of the page over on the right-hand side, actually went for Donald Trump this time. In 2016, it stayed Democratic by a small margin. So clearly the Trump campaign knew what kind of voters they wanted. They wanted rural voters, they wanted working class voters in cities, but particularly in suburbs. And they also wanted to bring in traditional conservatives. They were able to do this very effectively in Ohio. Now, one of the bright spots for the Democrats was the early vote. Ohio had 3.4 million people voted early, either by mail or in person. That accounted for about 54% of all the votes cast in 2016. So a very significant number. But the Trump campaign was at work there as well. The early vote was about 65% for Biden and 35% for Trump. But if you put that 35% together with what happened on election day, you can see how it is that Trump was actually able to do a little better in Ohio than he did in 2016. And voter turnout went up from 5.4 million people to 5.7 million people. But a lot of the new votes were Trump votes.
John, I want to chip in here briefly. We were there in 2012, we were there in 2016. And I've got to say that we weren't that impressed by the Republican ground game back then. It certainly didn't seem as sophisticated as the Democrats. The Democrats seem to have, and maybe I'm wrong, but I want you to continue to make your argument. But is this one purely about tactics, not about policies? And you're suggesting that it's really about their ability to organize rather than whether it's the leader himself or the policies he's advocating.
Well, it's a bit of both, Nick. I think the Republican ground game in Ohio has typically been pretty good. Some years the Democrats have been better. I think it was particularly good in 2016 and 2020. But it's not just the mechanics of turning out voters, as important as that is. That's knowing the voters to turn out. And that's where the policy issues, many of the things that President Trump has emphasized, such as revising trade agreements, increasing jobs, controlling the border and immigration, these sorts of issues resonated with a particular set of voters. The Trump campaign and his Republican allies found them and got them out in large numbers in Ohio. But now I'd like to turn to Pennsylvania, which is still a work in progress. I actually live in Pennsylvania now, and I have to tell you that the state is in extraordinary disarray.
Where do you live, John? Just to give us an idea where you are.
I live just outside of Pittsburgh. If you go down to the lower left-hand side, you can see Pittsburgh. That's Allegheny County.
Yeah.
I live in Allegheny County, but I live outside of the city of Pittsburgh in the little town of Glenshaw, which I'm sure none of you have heard of. And the chief reason that I live here is because our grandchildren live here. But that's, you know.
I'm sure Ohio would never forgive you for retiring outside of the state.
I know. They're still not happy about it. But in any event, what happened in Pennsylvania, which was a very unfortunate thing for the state, was Pennsylvania was moving towards an expanded use of mail-in ballots. And they were going to test that out in 2020. And while they were getting ready to test it out, the pandemic hit and created just enormous problems. So there's all kinds of technical problems at the county boards of elections in Pennsylvania. But on top of that, of course, there was an extraordinary increase in the number of mail-in ballots, although in early votes of all kinds in Pennsylvania. Although it's important to note that while in Ohio, the early votes made up 54% of the vote in 2016, they only made up 40% of the Pennsylvania vote in 2016. So while there are hundreds of thousands of ballots, there wasn't quite the level of use of early voting, mail voting in Pennsylvania as there's been in some other states. Well, right now, Donald Trump leads in Pennsylvania. The absentee ballots are being counted. They're being counted at different times in different boards of elections. In some of the rural counties, they've all been counted. In many of the big urban counties, that counting is ongoing. And what I think we'll see over the next 3 or 4 days is that as those votes are counted, Donald Trump's margin will decline. and the election will get closer and closer. And then the question becomes, does it get close enough that Biden wins, or does Trump eke out a narrow victory like he did in 2016? But one of the parts of the state that matter to Trump, where you can see the big red rural areas, you can see the pink urban areas, the western part of the state, the area of Pittsburgh and north and south of Pittsburgh, those are the strong Trump strongholds. These are areas that were once heavily Democratic. They're now much, much more Republican. In Ohio, in Pennsylvania politics, they're called the heat counties. That's HEAT, because they're areas of coal and natural gas. And so a lot of actions occurring in that part of the state. But the Democratic stronghold is on the other side of the state. If we move right across the page, we'll come to the Philadelphia area. And you can see the city of Philadelphia, a very dark blue area. There's some blue suburban counties and then some sort of pink counties. That whole area is the Philadelphia metropolitan area. Very important part of the state, an area that significantly underperformed in 2016 by any measure. One of the reasons Trump was able to win in 2016 was that the Philadelphia metropolitan area simply didn't generate the votes that it usually does. It's unclear right at this moment how it's performing, but there are indications that it may perform well when all of the votes are finally counted. Another area of strength for the Democrats is if you go north is the Scranton-Spare area and Lackawanna County. I think if you go just south of that, you'll come to Lucerne County, which some of you there's Lucerne County. Light pink in this picture, important for Trump, but also that area was important for Biden. As many of you know, Biden was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and spent a good bit of time campaigning in the state where he was born. So Pennsylvania, a lot of people thought, unlike Ohio, a lot of people thought that Pennsylvania would be the state that determines the outcome. It may very well be, but that depends, of course, on what happens in other states. And let's look at just one more. Let's look at Michigan, a state that...
John, as you do that, well, I don't get, on Ohio, I could hear you saying it's about the ground game is about strategy. But from what I was seeing there in Pennsylvania, it sounds more like personality. You were talking about 2016. You were talking about the failure of Philadelphia to perform. And I'm presuming that was about Hillary Clinton.
You know, it does have, I think you're right, Nick. That's very observant. I think Pennsylvania politics on both sides is less about organization and it's more about the personalities of the candidates. Donald Trump is just beloved in the part of Pennsylvania that I live in. That doesn't mean that everybody's voted for him, but even people who didn't vote for him kind of understand like things about him. But the other end of the state, of course, the more democratic state, is really about the personalities of the Democratic candidates. And Biden, frankly, is just a much more congenial fit than Hillary Clinton was.
Yeah. In a moment, I want to get into that. I want to ask you why, because I think the overriding question for people watching this will be, why have people voted for Trump in such large numbers? I mean, for the rest of the world, by and large, looks upon Trump quite dimly. So there's this sense of, how has this happened? He's managed to get huge numbers out. The polls suggested otherwise, and yet he's managed to get them out. Obviously, you're talking about this in quite some detail, but we're trying to sort of get to the nub of that. Why would they want to do so? But so I'm interrupting you. I'm keen to hear more about Michigan while we're here.
Well, certainly. We can come back to those broader questions. In just a few moments, you're going to hear from my friend and colleague, Bill Hershey, who was originally from Michigan, although he spent a lot of his life in Ohio. So he can probably enlighten you on some aspects of Michigan. Michigan is a state that's dominated by one big city and the related urban area, Detroit. That's in Wayne County. The votes are basically counted in Michigan. Joe Biden's ahead by a tiny, tiny little bit. There will certainly be a recount and who knows what other kinds of legal action that may follow in the next few days and weeks. Because the margin is just very, very small. But here's something interesting. In Ohio, we saw the big cities underperformed in terms of generating votes. In the in Pennsylvania, the big cities may be performing well. But one of the reasons that Joe Biden has been able to pull out ahead is that Detroit has performed very well, and the broader Detroit metropolitan area, and the series of small industrial cities that surround that area, going up to Bill's hometown just a little bit up on towards the middle of the map, Flint, Michigan. So now in Michigan, you see a similar pattern to Pennsylvania and Ohio, which is pink suburbs, red hinterland, and blue cities. But notice that there are fewer red counties in Michigan than were in Ohio and Pennsylvania. That's partly because it's a different kind of state, but it's also because many of those rural areas or less urban areas are really tied in to the cities in a way that they aren't in some other states. So it's a very, very close election, but you can see that here's a place where the Biden effort, whether it was actual voter mobilization, whether it was advertising, or whether it was just simply generating some greater enthusiasm than voters had for Hillary Clinton, seems to have made a bit of a difference. But here too, just like Pennsylvania and Ohio, we have to note that the Trump campaign was very strong because coming into this election, nobody expected that Michigan would look like this. And so there's, kind of three snapshots of three important states. One is clearly in the Trump column, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan that are very much up for grabs. So thank you for your patience, and I'd be delighted to try to address your questions in some of these broader issues.
So, John, has the number of the sheer number, the turnout here is phenomenal on across the board. Has Trump managed to find new supporters, new voters? Has he kept the level at where he was, and that Biden is more competitive? What's the comparison with 2016 for Trump?
Yes, the turnout is up in almost every respect, not in every single county, but in almost every respect. And a large part of it was that Donald Trump was able to find additional supporters and turn them out. Some of them are people who had never voted before, just like many of the people that backed him in 2016 were new voters. But he's also made converts, people who had voted for Hillary Clinton. And of course, in 2016, he managed to make converts of some people who had voted for Barack Obama. So Trump has an appeal to a certain sector, really several different sectors of the electorate, and he was able to improve upon those numbers in 2020. Now, Joe Biden's been able to do some of that too. There are defectors from the Trump camp, but mostly there, I think it was mobilizing voters in these key states, sometimes more successfully than others, that had not voted in 2016. And in the big cities of Philadelphia and Detroit, I think that might be the key change on the Democratic side.
Right, getting them out. In a moment, a bit later, we'll be bringing in Professor David Dulio, who is based in Michigan and obviously knows the state very well. And so we'll be able to drill into that in a bit more detail. Let's start bringing in people's questions here generally. Caroline Sumnall, if we can bring Caroline up, because John is going to have to go soon. So we're going to deal with our Q&A with John first before we bring in our other panelists. So Caroline Sumnall, let's bring up Caroline if we can. It'll take us a moment. Yeah, go ahead, Caroline. Go on.
I just wanted to say a lot of people are calling Arizona as an issue because Fox has called it, but CNN hasn't. And inside the president's camp, they're saying that could be a real decider, which is interesting because of McCain. I just wondered what your views were on Arizona.
Well, there are really two different issues here. The issue of calling elections is a very controversial one in American politics, and on many, many occasions. And certainly Fox News was all by itself in calling Arizona because there are somewhere between 500 and 600,000 ballots outstanding in that state. So there's an issue, a longstanding controversy on that score. My sense, this is just me from looking at the various polls, but also talking to people in Arizona that I know, is that I think Joe Biden will probably win Arizona this time. It'll probably be very, very close, but I think he'll probably win it. Arizona is a state that's changing very rapidly, and a lot of it having to do with immigration. And when people think about Arizona down on the southwestern border, of course, they think of immigration from Latin America, which is certainly part of the story, although that's slowed down a little bit in recent times. But there's a tremendous amount of immigration from within the United States, people retiring to Arizona out of the Midwest, business opportunities that are opening up in the big cities of Phoenix and Tucson, and then a fairly substantial movement of people out of California into Arizona, sometimes because of the opportunities in Arizona, and sometimes because of some of the problems that California has been having. And these California migrants into Arizona are an interesting group. As a group, they're more conservative than the people they left behind in California, but they tend to be more liberal than many of the natives in Arizona. So, John McCain was, a national hero. He was able to bridge the gap for a long time among these different groups. But in his absence, the Republicans have had a very hard time in Arizona. Yeah. So I think in this thing that the Biden will probably prevail in the end.
John, one of the things we've been looking at in our series over the last 3 weeks is the importance of the suburbs. I mean, the burbs it was the cliche that this election was going to be fought and won in the suburbs. And with the demographic change taking places like, North Carolina, Virginia, it's already happened, that there was an argument that there was a swing towards the Democrats. And I guess that helps to reinforce the expectation in the opinion polls almost that you were going to see this blue wave take over these swing states. And that hasn't happened. Having said all of that, what's your feeling? Do you think that Biden is pushing towards a reasonable electoral college majority? I mean, we are seeing Michigan, Wisconsin. We're talking about the possibility even of Georgia going as well. Then there's Arizona, then there's Nevada.
Well, it's entirely possible that despite this being a nail-biting election right here at the moment, that Biden will end up with a fairly substantial electoral college victory, if indeed these close states break in his direction. And as I said at the outset of my comments, nail-biting aside, that was kind of the expectation, was that either for Trump or for Biden, that enough swing states would swing one way, and that would give someone a big victory. So it's entirely possible that we'll end up with, by a devious route, if you will, we'll end up with a Biden, substantial, not overwhelming, but substantial electoral college victory. But this depends on what happens in each of these states, and each of them has their own peculiarities. But back on your point about suburbs, I think you're right, and I think the pollsters were right to think about suburbs. But here's where I think they may have made a mistake. All suburbs are not alike. The rapidly growing suburbs of the Southwest and the South, very different group of people than the older, more settled suburbs of the Midwest and the Northeast. In fact, what are sometimes called the inner rim suburbs, the original suburbs, the ones closest to the cities, are really quite Democratic, whereas other suburbs are more Republican. So, it's interesting. We need to distinguish between different types of suburbs when we talk about the suburban vote.
Great, John. Well, listen, thank you very much for that. That's a really good introduction to where we are this evening. I'm going to start bringing in some other speakers now. Please, if anyone's got more questions for John, do write them in there. But we'll start bringing our other speakers now. Bradley Knott, you are a Democratic expert and pollster in Iowa. You were there on our tour during the primaries. What was your expectation going into this night? I mean, you've commissioned polls yourself. You must have been truly appalled by what you were seeing.
Well, I was not appalled by the surge that Republicans had. We actually caught that, So I think what's important to say on polling is that everyone looks at Nate Silver's 538 website, but that is actually running average of polls. So it's very difficult for them running averages to catch the late surge that campaigns build to. All campaigns build to a crescendo on election day, and that includes often late surges as people start to make up their minds. Certain events that might have happened earlier in the cycle suddenly occur, and they are become more determinative because of their proximity to the election. So I think that in Iowa, we actually caught with a respected poll on Saturday night, the Republican surge, and we foresaw sort of what happened in Iowa, which was for a year, we were very competitive. And all of a sudden the last few days.
Ann Seltzer's poll, is that right?
Yes, Ann Seltzer's poll, the Iowa poll. Yeah. And we basically collapsed. So I think that's what happens with the polling, and people keep screaming about why aren't they accurate? Because running averages don't catch late breaking movement. And they really should be talking about late polls in the process. But the problem is they talk about running averages all along, and then all of a sudden they'd have to change their focus. So they don't do that. But I think that's at least a counterpoint to some of this idea that you can't get polling correct. I don't agree with that. It's just tough because nobody answers the cell phones anymore.
I want to bring up a slide. Isabel, can you bring up the slide? This is by a researcher in Ohio, and he took all the polls that were published and he compared them with Trump's performances in each state. So if you look in the center there, that's the big black sort of line of bubbles, and that's the national average, and it was out by 7.2%. And then if you go along, I think can we just bring that slide slightly up, because you can see the states below. If we bring that screen just up a bit, we can see at the bottom of the screen. Maybe I just can't see it because I haven't got my screen, but each of those represents a state. But you can see significantly across the board, with the exception of 3 states on the right, Trump has been consistently underrated. So, I mean, there's inevitably going to be an investigation. What were they doing wrong? How did they fail to take account of the new voters that Trump was getting on his side? But Brad, is that? I mean, that seems to be the obvious thing to say.
What seems to be the obvious thing to say? That they didn't catch the late breaking trend, or that the idea of looking at running averages?
Yes, definitely. Yes, definitely. They should do.
The running average assumes every day is the same, and it's not, because you're building a crescendo on election day. So you need to capture the surges. You need to capture late movement. All of these races are relatively close within margins of error. Anything above, these polls now are so crappy. I mean, people do them online surveys. They do them. It's very difficult to do good market research these days because it's so difficult to get people to answer the phone. They don't answer their cell phones anymore. But anyway, I mean, that's my one point. It's just a counterpoint to that. And I'm not sure, Nick, did you have something else you wanted me to address? I mean, I do have a few points.
Go ahead. I think you've got something else to say. Go on.
So I think this race is essentially over, even though it's close. If you look at the outstanding vote in Nevada, Arizona, Michigan's already been called, Georgia, they are all in counties and precincts that have a heavy Democratic turnout. So that's why I feel like the race is going to be over. Biden's ahead in all of these except for Georgia. And I sort of see, and he's closing fast on Georgia. When you look at the 2 counties, DeKalb and Fulton, they are the heart of Atlanta, where he was winning, 85-15 in DeKalb County. So I think it'll eventually be over now until the Supreme Court or the litigation gets involved, and we'll see what all of these Mitch McConnell judges can do to that to our democracy in terms of counting the votes. But I think what this really raises, Nick, is an interesting question about what the electoral map in and U.S. politics is going to be. I thought before, when I was thinking for a bigger Biden turnout, I was looking, this is going to be moving south and west, with the Midwest dropping out. And I still think that's the direction over the next 20 years. But I think it's going to happen a little bit slower based on these results. And I would point out, we're all talking about what a great campaign Trump ran. Well, he's going to be the second president. You know, if he were to be elected, he'd be the only president ever to be elected twice without achieving a majority in the popular vote. So it's interesting. I start to see this as, how is the white vote going to break up? Because the black and the Latinos, Latinx are pretty solidly in the Democratic Party, although Latinx is not as solid as the black vote. White educated vote is solidly in the Democratic Party, but where are the white seniors going to go? And are those white suburban women who are reflexively Republican in the past, but were so appalled by Trump's uniquely outlandish behavior that they switched over? You know, that'll be the challenge.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. It's really, really interesting. But we're going to hold that thought for a moment, and I'm going to just pick up some of our other guests. Just to recap, that's Bradley Knott, who works with the State Public Policy Group. He's a senior Democratic campaign strategist, and he worked with us on our Iowa primary tour back in February, which is absolutely fascinating. I want to bring in Tom Baldino, Professor Thomas Baldino, who, if you were on our virtual tour in the last 3 weeks, you would have seen him speaking in Lucerne County about the vote there. Tom is he's a retired professor of politics there. Tom, can you hear us?
I can. Can you see me? I look rather
you're in the dark, but that doesn't matter. So long as we can hear you, that's fine.
I can change. I can change position and hopefully get this brighter. I'm not sure why it's.
That's good. That's good.
That's better. All right. So what can I share?
Yeah, I think we see, just to get an update on what's going now, do you expect the votes to trend? The votes are trending towards the Democrats. I guess there are two things. Will there be sufficient amounts for the Democrats to win the state? That's their goal. That's the first question. And what are the possible legal challenges to that?
Well, the first is more in my area of expertise than the second. But as I looked at the numbers before I joined, the mailed ballots that haven't been counted yet, there are sufficient numbers there to give Biden a slim victory. But we don't know exactly how they'll all break, all right? And we also been learning that there are ballots that are still in post offices that were never delivered, and will they be allowed to be counted? Of course, that's part of the litigation. As I looked at the breakdown of the Pennsylvania vote by county, it's very clear that Biden has done well and will continue to do well in Philadelphia County, the city, Bucks, not so much Bucks, but Montgomery, Chester, and Delaware. They're the ring suburbs around the city. In my county, which flipped in 2016 from having been Democratic to supporting Trump, Biden narrowed the gap. But I was concerned that he hadn't narrowed it to the level to the number that I thought would be very helpful for him. So Trump won here by about 58% of the vote, and right now he's leading by about 56. So that's better, but I was hoping that for Biden's sake, it would come down to 54. Biden did much.
Are you surprised by that? Are you surprised by Trump?
Yeah, I attribute it to the fact that Trump turned out even more white, non-college educated voters, because turnout here was very high, as it has been across the country and in Pennsylvania. Biden, however, did do much better he did better than Clinton did in Lackawanna County, which is Biden's home county, and Scranton is there. And then as I looked at some of the more rural, the many rural counties in the state, the gap that Trump had compared to 2016 actually increased. But then again, we're looking at counties where the total population is under 20,000 in some cases. So, but for Biden to win Pennsylvania, he's going to really need about 75% this was a back of the envelope, down and dirty calculation, about 75% of the remaining uncounted mailed ballots. And some of the counties actually haven't even begun to count their ballot. Literally, they haven't begun counting.
And it would
which
be
is
very
shocking.
difficult legally to stop that process, wouldn't it? It would for a court to make a decision saying that that you've got absentee ballots, you've got early voting.
Yes.
What would be the excuse to say you can't count those? I mean, it would be pretty bizarre for a court to rule that.
Yeah, that would be a pretty flimsy excuse to say that we were stopping the vote from being counted because the election day is over. As I was listening to various things on the radio, there hasn't been any concrete proof of fraud or any other manifestation by the Republican lawyers that something is dramatically amiss to grant the court the reason to intervene. But
Okay.
More importantly for Pennsylvania is one of the two states, along with Wisconsin, where the state Supreme Court upheld or decided the cases of what should be counted and how they should be counted. In other states, it was a federal judge who intervened, and the Supreme Court overturned those. So that's a crucial distinction. And I am guessing and kind of hoping that the Supreme Court stays out of this unless there is a clear example of some kind of malfeasance.
A conservative court tends to protect the rights of the state, and therefore, if your state Supreme Court had decided that.
Yes, but that's what we thought in 2000, and that's not what the court did. So who knows, right?
Okay. Great. Well, listen, Tom, please do stay with us. I know people are going to have questions for you. Let's turn to David Dulio, Professor David Dulio, who's the director of the Center for Civic Engagement at Oakland University in Michigan. David, thanks very much indeed for staying with us. How did you read the results in Michigan? I mean, it seemed to be pretty clearly pro-Trump. We knew that there would be a delay in terms of the Democratic turnout. Were there any surprises for you? Has this taken you by surprise in any way?
Not to a large degree. I think the sense here in Michigan, and John talked about it a bit earlier, that it showed you the important parts of the state. And if I can, I'll pull up one other map to give you a sense of maybe the difference between Michigan in 2016 and Michigan in 2020. I'll use the same, just give me a sec here.
Yeah.
Michigan in 2020, I'll use the same New York Times graphic or map that John had shared, and I think you can see that, right? So what you've got is the New York Times data, and each one of those arrows is a Michigan county. And each arrow is either going to the left, meaning more Democratic this year versus 2016, or to the right, more Republican this year. And you see not a whole lot of shifts in Michigan this year, except in some key places. That's Oakland County, that John mentioned was a sort of a suburban ring county. Up here in us Michiganders would call this up north. And that got significantly more Democratic. And I bring this up, I don't have it to show you, but in the same map 4 years ago was all red arrows, big magnitude shifts from 12 to 16 for Trump, for the Republicans. And I think that, frankly, that said a lot more about Hillary Clinton than it did about Donald Trump here in Michigan. I think that there was a pretty solid rejection of Hillary Clinton as a candidate 4 years ago. Less so, certainly, with Joe Biden. And I think just to revisit a couple of things that John had talked about in Ohio and Pennsylvania, many of the same, and he mentioned this, but many of the same dynamics at work here in Michigan in terms of geography, of changes from 4 years ago until now, in terms of enthusiasm and field work, ground game, that drove the result, I think, that we got. Enthusiasm was up on both sides, and turnout was up by both Democrats and Republicans. But I think stands to reason it was just more Democratic voters coming out than did 4 years ago, especially in places like Detroit.
Yeah, okay. So just want to recap here. Both sides really enthused. But despite that, think about the environment that we're in enormous economic crisis, COVID. For outsiders, why are people still voting for Trump? What's he offering them? And I think you're quite good at this, David. You know why he has that appeal and why he still has that appeal, despite everything that's happened over the past few months.
Sure, and I, John mentioned earlier that there were slices of the electorate and different areas or different constituencies maybe that are very responsive to Trump, and there are several of those here in Michigan, including and I'll give you two. Sort of it's no surprise that Republicans do well in rural areas, and Trump really drove turnout in rural areas, more so in 16 than 20, but still he got a lot of folks out who probably hadn't participated in presidential politics, at least maybe for a while, out in 2016, and I think most of them came out and voted in 20. The other one is the famous Reagan Democrats that were discovered by Democratic pollster Stan Greenberg here in Macomb County, and he found that these voters considered themselves Democrats, but liked Ronald Reagan because they thought he was tough. They thought he was looking out for American interests. That he would stand by and make tough decisions.
And I think people are quite familiar with the comparison, but you're not saying that that Trump is the Reagan of our time.
Oh, absolutely not. And I think that there's the interesting thing to compare that era to now is that Greenberg came back and did research on those same types of voters after 2016 and found very similar trends, but I think a key difference is I don't think those folks are Democrats anymore. Back in the 80s, they voted for Reagan, but they also voted for Democrats in other offices. Today in Macomb County, as we sit here with results, they voted for Trump, they voted for John James, they voted for other countywide Republicans, and they're probably not Reagan Democrats anymore, but they're Trump Republicans. And it'll be really interesting to see how down the road the Republican Party tries to engage with voters like that, because there are a bunch of them out there, non-college educated, white, that refrain, right? It'll be really interesting to see how Republicans try to keep them as part of the party and as part of and engaged in the party.
I think this is absolutely fascinating because on the one hand, as we were talking about earlier, you've got the expansion of the suburbs, you've got the expansion of more liberal college-educated people, and then the blue-collar whites, and we thought that was a fading electoral base that you couldn't, there's no future in that. You think about the diversity of the United States changing, in becoming more diverse. So I'm absolutely fascinated that that's still a political force that can keep going, or at least they think so.
I know you want to move on. Just two quick points about that. Yeah. One, that was enough for Trump in 2016, right? Engaging that sector. Not so in 2020. The other thing is, I pointed to Oakland County when we looked at that map, and it's really interesting there. Trump got creamed in Oakland County, which is suburbia. It's well-educated, it's wealthy. There's a lot of suburban white women that went hard against the Republican Party in 2018. They did so against Trump again in 20. But John James, U.S. Senate candidate, who looks like he's probably going to lose against incumbent Gary Peters, but by a really, really thin margin. I mean, 10,000 votes, 15,000 votes at the end. John James did much better in Oakland County than Trump did. And I think it stands to reason that voters in places like Oakland County, those suburban voters, rejected Trump and his brand of politics, right? His style, his personality, et cetera. But they were comfortable, many of them, many more of them, comfortable voting for John James. an African-American Republican, businessman, war vet. He was pretty much straight out of central casting in some respects. And they did not, many more of them voted for him, I think, because they weren't turned off to Republican policies, at least the way James was pitching them. They were turned off to Trump and his personality.
Okay. Thank you very much, David. We'll come back to you as well. Please do start putting more questions in. We'll get people's questions. Get your microphones open very shortly. Our last panelist is, and certainly not least, is Bill Hershey, William Hershey, who was our expert in both 2012 and 2016 in Ohio. Bill, you've been a veteran of many political campaigns. Which was the first presidential campaign you covered? You're going to need to open up your microphone, which is on the bottom left-hand side of your computer screen. There you go.
I think the first presidential campaign I covered was 1980, Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter. I covered it in Ohio, and I covered every one since then until I worked with you in 2008.
Right, 2012, I think was the first time with us anyway. But Bill, just reflecting upon this campaign, what struck you? I mean, this, for anyone watching it, it's astonishing, but what struck you as being particularly different about this? I know Trump as a person is exceptional, but just focusing on the campaign, what did you think was out of the ordinary and different?
I think the thing that sticks with me is the social media and the president's ability to use it. He doesn't need anyone to speak for him. He tweets, and that was just beginning to take hold when I left covering campaigns, and the president is a maestro at it, and paid advertising, public appearances don't make any difference. But the second thing might be quite obvious, the pandemic. That Trump's rallies are the type of rallies Democrats used to have, at least in Ohio, big crowds cheering, and Biden was silent. He was known for his mask, and as the president said, he stayed in his basement for a long time. And perhaps that was the best strategy for him to use, but I'd never covered a campaign where the candidate stayed out of sight rather than in sight.
Amazing, absolutely, yeah. And he might have played both ways. Maybe he lost, maybe he gained. Jane Sufjan, I know you had a question earlier. Let's bring Jane up. Do you want to open your microphone, Jane? I know Bradley has written some short cryptic answers, but we may have more people who can offer opinions as well. So Jane, go ahead and ask your question.
It's Carlos rather than Jane, but the question was in relation to Nevada. It appears that Nevada's 6 votes may be very critical for Biden if he doesn't take Pennsylvania particularly. And it looks as though Biden is underperforming Clinton as against 2016 in Nevada. And so it's now very, very, very close. And I was wondering if anybody could comment why Biden appeared to be doing much worse in Nevada than in 2016.
Brad, do you want to take that? And I might get somebody else to comment as well.
Yeah,
Brad?
my take on Nevada was, I'm not sure that he is performing much worse, but I just haven't seen those numbers lately. But Nevada is a union state and run by Harry Reid's organization. Harry Reid retired as Senate Majority Leader, I think 4, maybe 6 years ago. And that legacy has never been, really picked up by any other candidate there yet. So the Democratic Party may not just be as strong in Nevada and its get out the vote operation that it once was.
I saw a comment on Twitter, which I quite liked, was that it'd be ironic that Nevada, the gambling state, was the one that sealed the fate of a failed gambling owner.
I love it.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that last question about, David or Tom on I'm just thinking of Nevada Where do you can either of you give a guess as to what Biden's majority is going to be? Tom, I think I asked you earlier, but what's your best guess, David, in terms of what you see at the moment?
I don't know a lot about Nevada, but I do know that it's also driven by geography. So there's kind of a theme that's coming up in a lot of these comments that, there's and I would point you to a political scientist at UNLV, University of Nevada, Las Vegas. His name's David Damore, and he wrote a couple of chapters for some books that I edited. But he talks about the sort of three areas of Nevada with that population center in Las Vegas, and the county is escaping me. Clark County, maybe. But there's also a large. Is that it? There's also a large rural part of the county or part of the state, and I would imagine that Trump drove turnout in rural Nevada like he did in many other states across the country.
Right.
If I may, so my wife has a cousin who lives in Carson City area, and that's typically conservative. It went for Biden, so he was thrilled about that, and it may give an indication that there is some, even though it's very, very close, what I understand is the largest ballots in Nevada are in the Las Vegas area, in Clark County. And those should trend for Biden, all things being equal, so.
Yeah.
I think, Nick, the other thing about Nevada is that I should have mentioned was, the tourism and travel and entertainment industry is the hardest hit part of our economy right now with the pandemic, and obviously that drives Las Vegas and Carson City. So those people may not be there. They may have left, or they may be just despondent, or they may, be angry at Trump. So.
Yeah. Anna Logan had a good question. Anna, you've got a good question here. Go on, Anna.
I put in two questions, so I'm not sure which you referred to.
Well, I tell you what, let's do, I think the one on exit polling has been answered, so do the second one.
Okay, so my question was, really, Bill Hershey might be able to answer this, and that is, it seems to me that the Republicans have acted totally irresponsibly in what they call their ground movement, in holding these big rallies and knocking at voters' doors, getting people to come face to face, paying no attention whatsoever to COVID-safe rules. So if that's part of the ground movement, it seems really irresponsible.
Bill, from my point of view, I would agree with that personally, but as an electoral tactic, it's certainly engaged their base, hasn't it, Bill? I don't know if you can hear me, but we may have lost Bill Hershey, but
yeah, I didn't hear you.
Yeah, Bill. So Anna Logan was saying from Australia that the Trump rallies were irresponsible. They're basically spreading the disease in this environment, and it's why would people be attracted to that? But I guess my point was it's a different. He's trying to appeal to a different group of people.
I think they were attracted to it because they agree with, just from my conversations in my neighborhood and around, with the president's point of view that we are turning the corner, or they're fatalistic. They saw nothing irresponsible about doing it. And the president's chief medical advisor now is a radiologist, I think, who knows very little about infectious diseases, but they believe him that masking and 6-foot distances and big crowds are not a problem. So they line up with the president and don't see it as irresponsible. Yeah.
Tom, where does the Republican Party go from this? With just coming back to the question that we were talking about with David, they did very well previously in 2016. They seem to have done amazingly well, all things considered, in terms of the turnout, but it hasn't been good enough. Do they stick with this, or do they have to change tactics? They're going to be huge questions, aren't there?
Yes, and I just literally read something before we came on that McCarthy said, the representative from California and minority leader, that this is Trump's party. I mean, essentially, he was saying that the Republicans owe Trump a great deal because not only has, Trump may win the presidency yet, but he's helped take back a few seats in the House, held on to the Senate, and some of the state houses didn't flip to the Democratic Party. So McCarthy is essentially committing, from his perspective, the Republican Party to stay behind Trump. Now, how that plays out if Trump were to be out of the White House remains to be seen. But I think there's also a question of what happens to the Democratic Party even if Biden wins. And how does Biden hold whatever coalition he's created? And it's going to be a really loose coalition, in my opinion. How does he hold them together? Who does he put in his cabinet to appease the extreme wings in the party and build the kind of foundation that will allow, whether it's him or another Democratic candidate, to win in 2024? And it's hard to think about 2024 when we don't even know who's won 2020, right? But so I think both parties have some things to sort out. And in the long run, I'm not sure that the Trump coalition will be successful in winning elections beyond, say, maybe 2024. But beyond that, it's turned off young people. It's turned off most people of color. And it's, as someone said earlier, the Latinx population is not cohesive. It's not uniform. And appealing to the various segments of Hispanic voters is something that is going to be challenging for both parties, more so, I think, for the Republican Party.
Yeah, and I guess the shock is that it's done so well this time, although it hasn't done well enough. Philip Godfrey, you've got a good question coming up, I think. Go on, Philip.
Yes, I think, hello, good evening, all of you. Professor Baldini, you really, I think, touched and answered perhaps the point I was going to make. Being a bit parochial from this side of the pond, it often seems to me that conversations about American politics are so dominated by Trump's personality and the aberrations contained therein, if that's your particular bent, that we quite quickly lose sight of the political and cultural and economic forces that are going to be there when he is either re-elected and goes in 4 years or goes now. And I wonder to what extent the Democratic Party is beginning to try and grapple with those forces, because 70 million voters can't be wrong. There are significant constituencies, religious constituencies, gun-owning constituencies. Those, you want to call them deplorables if you're a Clinton, or you can say people who have been marginalized through globalization. That is not going away. And there's a similar phenomenon in Western Europe. And I just wondered to what extent that Trump's, sort of overarching, overweening personality with all of its characteristics has almost disguised that more fundamental set of forces. Is history made by great men or weak men, or is it made by these forces? What's the view, do you think, from the Democrats' point of view?
Bradley, I think you're in a really good position. Iowa being that sort of slightly more conservative, more rural, which would be, it's sort of more Trump territory, if you like. Go ahead, Bradley.
Yeah, I think one of the divisions that Philip didn't mention, but is going to be very significant, especially in the Midwest, the Rust Belt states that we've been talking about here, is the urban-rural divide, the suburban divide. But rural, I worked on, ran 2 independent expenditure campaigns this cycle for in Iowa, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. We put in 50,000 yard signs into what are called pivot counties, those who voted for Trump or Obama, then Trump, and they had to be rural states as well. And the underlying theory there is that Republicans have branded Democrats in small towns so effectively that the default position is to be a Republican. It's to spit on the Democrats. They feel it's a coastal party. It's a intellectually elite party. And they've done that very effectively, Republicans have. So what we did is just trying to let other people know there are Democrats and progressives out there in these small towns. And I think that kind of effort is going to have to continue to just keep working in the rural areas. And our policies are pretty consistent with rural development. but we don't get credit for it because of the emotional attachment or detachment to the Democrats.
Right. If you do get the presidency, it looks like you don't have the Senate. What does that mean? We were touching on polarization and partisanship on Monday evening. And does that environment mean that you're going to have two parties that are willing to strike bargains, or not at all?
Well, there's nothing about this election that suggests less tribalism than what we had before it. So it's going to be up to Biden to see what he can do to sort of bring some Republicans over. I was just thinking, somebody mentioned the cabinet. Maybe he ought to name a Republican senator to his cabinet and replace him with it in a state where the Democratic governor could replace them. But there's going to have to be a lot of work between Biden and Mitch McConnell. You know, they actually had a history of that in the Obama years. It was always Biden who came in at the end and ended those government shutdowns that McConnell was heading up. So, you know, let's see if Joe's 47 years means something.
Yeah. Okay. And Andy Mendes. Hello, Andy.
Hi. Hopefully this nasty Apple stuff works. It sort of follows on, because I heard today, I think, that if Trump loses, which let's make that assumption, that he's likely to be criminally indicted in New York and possibly for federal offences. I also heard somewhere, maybe on one of the previous talks, that one way out of the legal battle might be for Biden to offer a presidential pardon to Trump in return for him dropping the legal cases. And I wonder if I'm fantasizing or whether that's actually a realistic possibility.
Let's get David Dulio and Tom Baldino on. David, to start with.
Sure. I think that that's a long shot for multiple reasons. One is I don't think Trump is going to give up any chance that he thinks he has and admit defeat. I also think it might be a heavy lift to get a pardon from Biden, one of his first his first actions as president, and because that would really irritate the progressive wing of the party that already has. I think there's tension there with Biden, right? I mean, we've seen him try to walk the line on a couple of things between the sort of moderate wing of the Democratic Party and the progressive wing. So I think that would be a tough sell to them.
Right. Okay. Tom, what's your view?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's much more likely that Trump will pardon himself and see if that flies than Biden pardoning Trump. I also think it's very likely that Trump, if he loses, he will pardon many people who were helpful to him and who are either already indicted, or have either already been convicted or indicted. So there will be some criminal prosecutions of Trump in state courts, and that will be something that Biden can then step away from and say, I won't, as a president, pursue my political enemy in the federal courts, but let the state courts go after him for any shady business dealings. And I think that's much more acceptable, maybe not to Trump supporters, but to the community in general.
So, Tom, are we all assuming that Biden is going to make it? There may be some hiccups. There may be results not published for another 2 weeks, but essentially he's won so many swing states, or at least 4 or 5, that it's not possible for Trump to counter it.
I hesitate to say that he's definitely going to win, but right now it looks like he's going to win. And the challenge for Biden will be, how does he negotiate with Mitch McConnell, who is going to be heading up the Senate? And as a former senator and someone who came of age in the Senate when it was people working across the aisle on a regular basis, if anyone, and Bradley pointed this out, if anyone could do this in a way, it's Biden, because he was doing it for Obama in over the 8 years that they were in office. So, the earlier question about the divisions in the society, if Biden does nothing else during his next if he wins during the next 4 years, it's healing the divisions as much as he can to allay the fears of those people in the Trump camp who think of all Democrats as socialists, which around here is what I hear most frequently. The Democrats are socialists, they're going to destroy America. Of course, the other side thinks that Trump has already destroyed America and, so on and so forth. So if Biden can heal the divisions or at least make inroads in healing those divisions, he will have accomplished something.
Yeah. Neil Fleming.
Much of mine's probably been answered, Nicholas. I'm wondering about, even assuming Biden gets a comfortable margin in the Electoral College if he wins, what bodes for the US, given that President Biden won't have a majority in the Senate? And won't Trump, even if legal actions go in Biden's favour, won't Trump just be a constant running distraction, constantly maintaining a Twitter feed, running his own promoted political rallies, etc., for 4 years? In other words, won't Trump just be continuing as the effective leader of the opposition?
Yeah. Brad, do you want to chip in on that? I know you don't have access to Trump's diary for 2021, but what's your projection?
Well, I think at that point, it's going to be interesting to see what the Republican Party does, because they've been putting up with this creep for 4 years for their own personal political gain. And now he's been defeated twice, popular vote-wise. It's hard to imagine that they'd want to stay with him. But yeah. I don't know, man. I just don't know. It's so tribal. It's so tribal out there just in the last 5 years. It's just...
Claudia Baker, you've got a good question. This comes back to our briefing, which we did in Florida, when we spoke to a pollster there who had his projections were much, much closer to the mark than the rest of the polls, although he did suggest that Trump was going to win most of the swing states, but by very, very small margins. So he was incorrect in terms of the results, but in terms of the percentage, he was much closer to it. Claudia.
In future elections, do you think we should listen more or take more attention to, pay more attention to the views of the Trafalgar Group?
Now, Brad, you answered this slightly in a way earlier because you're talking about late moves in an election. But what's your view of the Trafalgar Group?
Well, Trafalgar Group uses a very unique, I hesitate to say cutting edge, but methodology in their polling, from online surveys to AI questions where they never actually, where they don't ask you the matchup questions. They try to infer from your answers of some more general questions how you are going to vote. So their methodology is questioned by conventional wisdom very seriously. So we'll have to learn a little bit more about that and see how market research evolves in this area of artificial intelligence and computers asking questions based on the responses. And it's pretty funky.
Okay.
So, we do try that a little bit in my business, but.
Simon Jackson.
Hello. I was really struck in a previous webinar about comments that the polls in 2016, what one of the key things that got wrong was that people who were Trump supporters often just didn't fess up that that's what they intended to do. And in other words, they were more than happy to mislead pollsters. And I was wondering, and when you were talking earlier about this late surge, if you could put this down to undecided voters finally making up their mind, or is there a big element about Trump supporters deciding to go ahead and be brave and just say that's what they were going to do, even if they had been previously not so forthcoming about their intentions?
Tom Baldino, what do you make of that? The hidden Trump voter, the shy Trump voter?
I haven't done any polling on this, so I'm not sure, but I think there are people who, let me start by saying the Trump voters or the people who are Trump supporters in my area, they're very vocal and they're out there. Those who might be the shy or less enthusiastic Trump voters, if there are such things, I'm not sure how they would have complicated the polling other than by not answering the phone or refusing to answer any polls. More likely, I think once again, and again, I'm not the expert, I'm not sure that the polling organizations properly accounted for so many white male or white female non-college educated voters, because that's who seem to have come out in this area, or at least in the state, in the rural areas.
Do you expect them to be politically engaged? Because I think we've seen a record turnout of young people. You certainly had a much higher black vote. So across the board, you see people who have been more engaged than beforehand. Do you expect them to maintain their political engagement, Tom?
That's an excellent question. Typically, there's a reason why people who haven't been engaged get engaged. And in this instance, it's Trump. So this is kind of what I would call a cult of personality. Trump will not, in a kind of response to the earlier question, Trump's not going away. He will find a way to make money from his personality, and whether it's his own network or television show on Fox, he will be there. He will have his Twitter feed and he will annoy the heck out of Joe Biden. But having said that, if there is a comparable personality in the Republican Party who can keep those people engaged, then they will be engaged. I don't see Mike Pence, should he decide to run in 2024, mobilizing these same voters. I don't see that.
Okay. The next question then for me.
Go on,
Brad.
I'm sorry, but and the political science professors here maybe could dive into this and report back, but there's a phenomena that I didn't really see explained, and I'm interested about is Republicans did a really good job of registering new voters across the battleground states. And that's a real curiosity as to how they did that. Because usually Democrats or the out of power party will, have a bit of a surge. The enthusiasm for trying to win gets a bump, especially in the Iowa caucuses. And Republicans out-registered us even in Iowa. So I wonder if something's going to be revealed about that effort. I think they spent a lot of money for the last 4 years, and they did a lot of organizational work. And one of the ways that we talked about that here was sort of came to that conclusion was in 2016, you'd see a lot of Trump signs by themselves. In 2020, it was always with several other Republican signs. And I assume that was an organizational effort.
Brad, we know that Biden has said he's only going to stay for one term in office. So we know that Kamala Harris is going to be fighting the next election if Biden becomes president.
Well, I think it was more conditional than that. He didn't say he hasn't said.
Okay, well, let's put that as presumption. How do you see her fortunes with this current electorate? But how do you see her fortunes in 4 years' time? It's going to be tough, isn't it?
Yeah, well, if you base it on her campaigns in this cycle, yeah, she's going to have a tough time organizing. But on the other hand, she is in a perfect position to be the face of the new Democratic Party.
Right.
Person of color, female, coastal.
Okay. I would have thought female people might have prejudice against that. Also, race people have prejudice against that. So I guess it's a barometer of how much the US has changed. That's the gamble.
Well, you're talking US, I'm talking Democratic Party.
Right. Okay. David, what's your take on that, on the vice president or possible vice president?
Well, I think, Joe, let's just take Michigan, and you could probably extrapolate it to places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin too. But, if Senator Harris were at the top of the ticket this time around, I don't think she carries those states. I think that the brand of Democratic, Brad mentioned this new Democratic Party. I would be concerned if I was a Democrat about how that brand of politics plays here in Michigan, outside of Detroit and maybe parts of the suburbs. And who knows, maybe it's enough, right? But Joe Biden came to Michigan and talked, frankly, he talked a lot like Trump. He talked about make it in America, make it in Michigan. He talked about trade, as did Bernie Sanders when he ran for the Democratic nomination 4 years ago and in 2020. He went to Macomb County, and Biden did, and stood in front of automobiles and talked to auto workers about those same messages. And I think that helped Biden here this time around.
Okay. Bill, we're going to wrap up quite soon. Bill, do you have any more comments or thoughts? You've been listening into this patiently. You're a wise man who's covered this for a long time. What are your views?
I'm trying to digest the what looks to be the climax of the election. It looks like Biden is going to be elected president, and I don't know what the future of the Republican Party in Ohio will be after that. But I think, as someone just said, Trump's still going to be around, and I think he's going to continue to dominate or have a big impact on politics, both here in Ohio and nationally. And we just have to wait and see how well Biden can put a bit of a curb on this tribalism that has divided the country so much.
Yeah. Okay. I want to wrap this up with one final question, both to David and to Tom. Do you agree with that that thesis that this was about Republican organization that enabled them to get their numbers up high? Is that it? And then ultimately, why did if Trump has lost, why has he lost? Tom.
Okay. So I think the Republican Party was very well organized in this election, and they helped Trump not lose as badly as he could have, given if Trump was left to his own devices, he probably would have been beaten more soundly. This is obviously, this race is not over yet, but I'm not sure that there is a future in the Republican Party for moderate Republicans of the Susan Collins variety. Looks like she's won her seat. In fact, I think I did see it called. But what happens to her and maybe a Ben Sass? I don't know. He is kind of conservative, but the Republican Party, regardless of, again, the outcome here for Trump, I think it's going to have Trump kind of flavor to it. And that's going to make it more difficult for the Republican Party, in my mind, to be competitive in future years nationally. But, we'll see how this plays out.
Different take, David?
Yeah, I think go back to 2016, because I think that's 2020 relative to that is important. And in 2016, you had a couple of things come together that sort of made this perfect storm. And Trump maybe caught lightning in a bottle with it, where he came with this unique brand of politics that energized voters that weren't voters before, many of them, and spoke to a segment of the electorate that felt that they were left behind. At the same time, he had a deeply unpopular opponent in Hillary Clinton, and that really mattered. Especially in a place like Michigan. In Wayne County alone in 2016, Hillary Clinton got 80,000 fewer votes out of that one county than Barack Obama did 4 years prior. So fast forward to 2020, I think the Republican ground game was excellent, and they did a lot of work and they spent a lot of money, as has been mentioned. But I wonder if that was not a reaction to knowing that Democrats would be more energized themselves, and that they wouldn't have the advantage of facing a candidate like Hillary Clinton. So I think that there's something to it, but I wonder if it wasn't a strategic choice that they were forced into.
Okay, this plays into a question that Audrey, I think, has possibly got for me. Audrey Wolf. Audrey, mute button, bottom left-hand side. Are you there, Audrey, still? I'm not too sure you...
Yes, so I was wondering, Nicholas, if you yourself were surprised or taken by surprise at anything, especially some of the counties we spoke about.
Well, so I think some of us, quite a few of us here on the Iowa tour, and we saw Biden up close. And I just thought, this guy is not going to last a campaign. So from one perspective, I can understand why he stayed in the basement. Because I don't know if he had, I mean, the tactic is that he was letting Trump, do his work for him, but also I just thought he just didn't have the physical stamina to last. And I was surprised that the Democratic Party couldn't put up a candidate that was more, in my view, more competitive. But in the end, he seems like the ideal antidote to Trump. He's a conventional politician. He's establishment. He's been there for a long time. So for many people, a safe bet to bring the party together. Tom, you were going to say something?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm actually of a mind that Biden was the perfect candidate because he bridged, and fortunately for him, he was able to bridge the various wings of the party and present the kind of person who could win in Michigan. And might still win in Pennsylvania, remains to be seen, because he was able to appeal both to white working class people and to the bi-coastal elites that had been driving the party in 2016. So that's my 2 cents on it.
Okay.
Well, let me ask you this question, Nick. I know you got to go, but if Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar and a couple of those Democrats hadn't decided to get out and give the middle lane to Biden, what would have happened? And had any of the Republicans been willing to get out 4 years ago and let one candidate have the middle lane, we would never had Trump. So it's just an odd coincidence, I think.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating.
Good point. Very good point.
Thank you very much indeed, everyone. It's been really interesting. It's now 11:30 UK time. Well, 26 minutes past, 27 minutes past 6, I think, on the East Coast. And in that time, we've gone from a significant degree of uncertainty, at least half an hour before this program, to Biden trending to winning in a lot of those swing states. And this conversation now here, we essentially presume that he's going to be the next president of the United States, barring multiple court cases and cock-ups with counting, which would seem difficult in so many states. So I think that change has been taking place as we've been broadcasting. Thank you very much, everyone. Do stay on if you want to share your thoughts and comments. But my thanks to Bill Hershey for being with us, Professor John Green from Akron, Professor David Dulio from Michigan, Professor Thomas Baldino from Pennsylvania, and Bradley Knott. It's been really, really good. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Hey, Nick, I'm a professor too.
You're a professor too. I'm sorry. I should get that in. I should have got that in. Do stay on. If any of our guests want to stay on, they're welcome to do so. What we do are after the hours have a discussion together. I'm going to look ahead to our next discussions on Insight when we move away from US politics just for a while. We're looking at democracy in the Middle East. There's an NGO called Dawn. That's Democracy in the Arab World Now. And it was set up by Jamal Khashoggi, who was, as you know, killed by Saudi agents in Turkey. And this is here's the NGO that he set up. And there's a woman called Sarah Lee Whitson, who used to work for Human Rights Watch, who is running it. And they are suing the Saudis who were involved in that killing. And they're involved in a number of campaigns that are very interesting. So that'll be a fascinating conversation at 8 p.m. GMT next Tuesday. And then after that, the next day, I think, we've got another talk as well. I'm not too sure we've got a slide for this one, but we are discussing China and Taiwan, and that's with Professor Tsang from SOAS in London, and an analyst who works with the Pentagon, and her name is Oriana Scala Mastro. And that's really looking at the Chinese aim to take Taiwan, possibly within the next decade, is what they're saying, which seems a pretty frightening idea. But that's well worth tuning into, and that's on Wednesday at 8 p.m. I'm just going to get a few views. We've been speaking for a long time, so we won't take it out for too long. But Philip, I just want to come back to you as well. Just thinking back to our time in Des Moines, here we are with seeing Biden president. How do you feel about it, if it's going to happen?
That's me, is it?
Yes.
Yeah, I do share your surprise. I thought it was a rather canny strategy to keep Biden in his basement. I think aided and abetted by the media, which has been largely pro-Biden. I think they've managed to disguise his lack of mental acuity. And I think they've got him over the line. I think Trump did him a big favor in the first debate because he didn't let him get a word in edgeways. I think had he done so, maybe Biden's frailty would have revealed itself. So I think he's been well managed. What do I feel about it? Well, I think I'm a slightly more of a Marxist disposition on these things, or should I say champagne socialist, in that I'm less interested in personalities than the forces of history. And I think that America, like our own country, has got an enormous number of issues that it's going to need to deal with. And the personalities may well be dwarfed by them, but that's just a very personal perspective. I think, I think there are a lot of issues down the road. Is Biden up for it? I don't know. I think, the lack of the Senate is going to be a big issue. But I think there are structural issues that are going to plague Western democracies for many decades to come, with the great leveling between the global economies for a start. So that sounds a bit highfalutin, perhaps. But
no, it's great.
I tend to put these things into a slightly broader perspective, because as I said earlier in my question, I think you can get carried away with the personalities, and I wonder to what extent they have that much impact. Look at Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you, Philip. Sheila Conroy, you had a question. I didn't manage to get you in, but can you let's hear it anyway. Go on, Sheila.
Well, I wanted to give a brief plug for American democracy. In spite of the horrible, horrible situation we find ourselves in, and no matter who wins, we will be for the foreseeable future. Yesterday, I spent over 12 hours working in our local polling station, and there were probably in Longmont, Colorado, and there were probably somewhere between 50 and 20 poll workers, and they divide them equally between Republican and Democratic, except for me. And we had really a splendid day because people were, we saw nearly 1,000 people come in, and they were of varieties of old, young, Hispanic, white, some Asians, all ages. And the high spot of the day was a young man who came in with his naturalization certificate that he'd received that day. He came in, he registered to vote, he voted, and he said he wanted to volunteer for the next election. I mean, it was it's corny, but that's the way it's supposed to work. And I'm sure there are so many other towns, small, large, rural areas where people feel the same. And I'm just hoping to God that people like me and the others I was with yesterday can come out on top. I mean, that's what people should do. Sorry, that was it. God, we lost Nicholas.
Yes, we have. You're right.
Oh dear.
I'm sure
I didn't mean to drive you away, Nicholas.
No, I'm nothing personal. It will be his Wi-Fi that did it.
Sorry, it's the Welsh Borders Wi-Fi. It's has a habit of doing that. But I thank you for the contribution. I got the beginning of it. Stephanie, you've got a word to say as well. Stephanie Sorensen.
Well, I am also an American, and I wish I agreed with you more, but I suppose I tend to look at the pessimistic side of things. I've really never seen the country this divided, not even in the 60s. I know so many people who have stopped speaking to friends or family members because of the political divide. And personally, I probably listen to MSNBC too much because I am horrified at how many votes Trump got and how close this is. I really am.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing is to, I think that is the outset, the question I wanted to ask was how is that possible? And we did in the run up to this and to the election, we did a virtual tour and we covered Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and also Virginia. And we went to Republican strongholds and also to Democrat areas as well. So we saw a whole range of people. But I am astonished. Audrey had a question for me, which was about, was I surprised by something? And I certainly was surprised by the Republican turnout. And we have sometimes a speaker called Bob Paduchik, who was the co-chair of the RNC, and he is a brilliant organizer. He's a very, very good electoral strategist. He knows how to get people out. So there's part of that. But then the other question is really, how do you manage to vote for someone like Donald Trump, whose White House has been so chaotic? So even after all this time, that's something I do continue to struggle with. And I think a lot of us continue to struggle with. And the only way to deal with it is to keep on talking. And on Monday night, we had a session talking about polarization and bipartisanship. And if we don't keep talking, there are going to be more and more problems. I think there we're going to wrap it up. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for joining. It's been a really interesting discussion. And as we've been speaking, I think things have been changing, and I'm personally very interested to see what happens over the next 2 weeks, and possibly relieved if it all comes to a peaceful ending. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night.